Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. In today's exercise, instead of doing a formal painting, I'm going to go over the key marks and effects you can produce with watercolor. Think of them as the core components of the language of watercolor painting. I'm doing this because if I do a full painting, students are more likely to spend their time looking at the painting I'm producing rather than concentrating on the marks and the techniques I use to create the painting. Think of this as a checklist you can use when you do your own paintings in the future. So let's get started. I'll just start by mixing. Doesn't matter which colour you use, but for this exercise I'm just going to use some French ultramarine. And here I'm going to be painting wet on dry. Why is it wet on dry? Well, I'm painting directly onto dry paper with wet paint. And when I do this, you can see how there's this bead of paint that settles at the bottom of the wash, and the aim is to keep that bead flowing down the paper so that you end up with a lovely, nice, clean surface. Here I'm going to paint wet on wet. Now, all wet on wet means is that you're painting into a wet surface. This can happen in two ways. One, you can wet the paper like I'm doing now. Now I'm picking up the same mixture of paint I had there. So what you can notice here is I painted that, the paint flowed down the paper because my board is set at about 18 degrees. But the other thing is this wash here is lighter than that. And this is something you have to keep in mind. If you pre-wet your paper, effectively what you're doing is diluting your mixture of paint. So you have to take that into account. So this is wet on dry, this was wet on wet, but now I'll show you another wet on wet. But first I'll mix some other colour. I'll grab some permanent rose. So now we've wet the paper, but this time with paint instead of water. And I can go in there and drop in some other colours. So these are also wet on wet shapes, and typically with wet on wet, when you're mixing your colours, you end up with soft edges instead of sharply defined edges. Now here what we've created is a flat wash, which means that the tone of the wash stays the same all over the section of the painting. Now you can produce a graded wash by starting with a colour, then dipping your brush in water, dipping it into water again, maybe cleaning the brush. And you can see here we've gone from a darker tone to a lighter tone. And when we're talking about tone in painting, we're referring to the relative lightness or darkness. So this was all painted with the same colour. This is a darker tone of French ultramarine and this is a lighter tone. In watercolour, we produce a lighter tone by adding more water to the mix. And the less water, obviously, the stronger a tone that we'll have. Being careful to lift some of this moisture that's forming at the bottom of the tape. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll end up with a cauliflower. And a cauliflower is where some of this moisture at the bottom of the paper or on the edge is sucked back into the paper as it gets damp and pushes some of that paint away. So here we've got a hint of a cauliflower happening. Now, I'll just go over this concept of a bead again. When you're painting onto your paper, because I'm painting at an angle, you can see how the paint is flowing down and it forms this bead at the bottom of our wash. So what you do, have a good bit of paint in your brush and you paint into that bead, and the bead keeps moving down the paper with you, and it's that bead that helps leave behind this lovely flat wash. Now I'm painting very slow just to highlight this bead. As an experienced artist, you can paint so fast sometimes that the bead doesn't even get a chance to form as the paint just flows down behind your brush strokes. Now, if you're painting wet on dry, that's when you can create sharp edges. For instance, you've got some sort of funny building. And that's how you develop these sharp edges. You can't have sharp edges if the paper's already wet. What you can also do, and start with a sharp edge, but if you want the edge to be soft, or one edge to be soft, you can just get some clean water and then just lightly paint up to that edge there. And you can see how now we've softened the edge. So that's one of the ways you can soften the edge. I'll discuss some others as well. This technique can work if you were painting a tree trunk or a tree branch. And you want a shadow side and a sunlit side. So I can paint with the water into the sunlit side. Same here. So that's one area where you could use this technique to soften an edge. Another term you hear people talk about when painting with watercolors is dropping in color. So in this case, you can wet the paper with some paint, and then you can pick up another color and you just drop that in while the paper is still wet. That's what we refer to as dropping in. Depending on the consistency of the paint you drop in, you will have a range of marks. They'll still be soft edged, but the thicker the paint, the less that paint will flow, and hence a more defined shape you will have. Another technique that's similar to dropping in is when you use splatter or spatter. Both terms mean the same thing. Let's say we've got an area here and it's just flat green shape representing grass, but you want to add a little bit more interest to the shape. So what you can do in that case is you pick up a brush, in this case I'm going to use a smaller brush, mix a different color. Say I want to add some undulations or maybe small clumps of grass that you can't see any detail in. This is splatter. What I do here is hit either the hard part of my finger or the soft part of my finger. Each will create a slightly different effect. What I recommend with splatter is you just get a sheet of paper and practice. Practice with different size brushes, tapping your finger harder or softer. By the way, if tapping your finger causes you pain, say in case you have some arthritis or something like that, well, I don't want you to run around whacking your finger with your brush. In that case, you can just pick up another brush and tap that. If you tap too hard, the paint will jump around too much. So learn to tap just the right amount so that the paint lands roughly where you want it to go. The other thing that's important with splatter is the paint generally will go in the direction that the brush is pointing. So if I was to tap my finger hard here, the splatter will go up here. If you don't want that to happen, turn the brush to the side and just tap it this way. If for some reason you need to tap it this way to create some sort of vertical shape, well, that's when you get a piece of paper, as long as the paper underneath is dry, and use the paper to protect your painting. Another common technique with watercolor is lifting paint. I'll start by just filling this square with paint. There's a number of lifting techniques you can use. One, you can get a tissue like this and say I wanted to hint at the shape of a cloud in the sky, and I can just very lightly touch the paper with the tissue. And that can create quite a realistic cloud shape. And you can also get a thirsty brush. So what a thirsty brush is, we'll clean the brush and we'll squeeze just about all the water out. Don't pull the hairs, however, otherwise you'll pull them out of the ferrule, which is this metal bit. And then you can use that to create some shapes. This works very well with paints that don't stain the paper. So French ultramarine doesn't stain the paper, and I can lift a lot of that paint up. Another technique you can use to lift dry paint is you pick up a stiff brush like this, dip it in water, take out about 90% of the water, you don't want it too wet, and then you can just very lightly scrub the shape you want to lift. Another technique you can use when you want to lift some paint is you can create a little stencil like this. Again, don't have too much water in your brush. This is just a very rough stencil. You can very quickly create a repetitive shape doing that. Another important technique we use when painting with watercolors is called dry brush. The name is a little bit confusing because it's not so much that you're using a brush that's dry, though it is easier to do when you're learning, when you don't have too much paint in your brush, but it's more a matter of how quickly you lightly drag your brush across the paper and utilizing the texture of the paper and the speed of the brush to create what we call a broken edge by using this dry brush stroke. This is very useful if you're painting beach scenes because you can create the sea foam by effectively leaving the white paper, and that reads very well as sea foam. Instead of dragging the brush in a straight angle like that, you drag it in a more curving shape, where think you're painting the sky, and what you have here is the clouds. Okay, so you can use it for creating straight dry brush strokes and also these more curved strokes. The white of the paper in this case is the white of our painting. Another very important watercolor technique is glazing, and glazing is where you paint over a dry area of paint. So in this case, this area is dry. I've made sure it's dry because I've got the hairdryer on it, and then I've got some of this reasonably weak permanent rose, and I'll just quickly do a glaze over that. This is a technique you would use when painting a shadow over an area. You paint the original shape, and then when that's dry, paint the shadow over it. You might also use this technique if the underpainting wasn't strong enough in tone, and you can just paint over that same shape again to strengthen the tone. So these are the basic techniques that you use when painting watercolors. It's not a complete list, but I would say 95% of the work done on a watercolor painting is done using these techniques. I purposefully didn't talk about the different brushes you can use when painting with watercolors. I've kept it simple, and I've just used a round brush. For most watercolor artists, the round brush is their main brush. However, in the future I'll do another video looking at the different marks you can create with different types of brushes. It's good to spend some time doing simple exercises like this so that you focus more on your technique rather than on creating a wonderful painting. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. It helps me out a lot. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.